Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to take you on a slow journey into the hushed corridors of the past, where history is not told with urgency, but with the calm rhythm of a quiet lullaby. Together, we will wander through forgotten streets and cloistered halls where the voices of women once echoed, brilliant and unyielding, though the world often chose to silence them. This is the story of why life was unbearably difficult for smart women in the medieval age. A time when wit and wisdom were not rewards but punishments, when intellect often led not to admiration but to suspicion. So, settle yourself somewhere comfortable, soften the edges of your mind, and let us begin. Imagine Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, a land of castles with heavy stone walls, monasteries where candlelight spilled over parchment, marketplaces alive with chatter, and streets filled with mud after the rain. Life itself was difficult, for plague and famine visited frequently, and superstition reigned almost as strongly as kings. Yet, amid these burdens, women carried an extra weight. Their worth was often measured not by their thoughts, but by their obedience, their capacity to marry, bear children, and serve quietly. To be clever, dangerously clever, was to step outside the boundaries carefully drawn by both church and custom. From the start, girls were raised under the shadow of expectations. A daughter might be taught to sew, to cook, to tend to the household. Few were permitted to read, fewer still to write. Education was largely reserved for boys, meant to prepare them for priesthood, politics, or trade. But what of the girl who showed a restless mind, who asked too many questions, who listened too closely to sermons and spotted contradictions, who dreamed not of spinning wool but of unravelling mysteries of scripture or science? She was a puzzle society did not wish to solve. The medieval world had a clear suspicion of female intellect. The teachings of the church leaned heavily on older traditions, claiming that Eve, through her curiosity, had brought sin into the world. To be inquisitive as a woman was, in some eyes, to walk in Eve's footsteps, and therefore to tempt disaster. And so the brightest of women often found themselves caught in a cruel paradox. The very qualities that made them remarkable were those that marked them as dangerous. Picture a young woman, perhaps the daughter of a minor noble, fortunate enough to have access to a private tutor. She learns to read Latin, recites psalms, even dips into philosophy. Her father, proud at first, shows her off at gatherings until whispers begin. Is it proper for a girl to know such things? Doesn't she overstep her place? Her knowledge soon becomes a liability, shrinking her chances of a good marriage. Suitors, uneasy, wonder whether such a woman might prove too challenging, too outspoken, or too disobedient. Knowledge, which should have been a jewel, became a chain that weighed heavily around her neck. Even for women in convents, places that sometimes offered rare refuge for scholarship, the life of the mind came with limits. Yes, a nun might copy manuscripts, compose hymns, or study theology, but always under the strict gaze of her superiors. Creativity and inquiry were praised only so long as they stayed within the safe walls of orthodoxy. To stray, to interpret scripture too freely, to question doctrine, that was a perilous act. Many abbesses and nuns who wrote extensively left behind works tinged with careful humility, prefacing bold insights with words like, "I am but a weak and foolish woman, unworthy to speak." It was a shield, a way to soften their brilliance, so that it would not be mistaken for pride, or worse, heresy. And then, of course, there was the ever-present shadow of accusation. To be too knowledgeable in herbs was to risk being called a witch. To be eloquent in theology was to risk charges of arrogance. To argue, to debate, to insist upon one's voice, these were acts that could, in darker times, invite punishment. For medieval society often turned suspicion into spectacle, and women of intellect were sometimes dragged into trials where their words were twisted into weapons against them. But before we drift further into those dangers, let us pause here at the threshold of our story. Tonight we are setting out not just to recount dates or names, but to wander through the emotional landscape of these women's lives. Imagine their secret joys, the delight of opening a rare book, the warmth of whispering forbidden ideas to a trusted friend. Imagine too their fears, the shiver of hearing their name in the marketplace coupled with the word unnatural, the dread of seeing their ambitions quietly dismantled by family or clergy. This journey will not rush. It will take its time, flowing gently like a stream through valleys of memory. We will travel through castles and convents, through markets and lecture halls, through libraries lit by candlelight. Along the way, we will meet remarkable women who dared to shine, and countless others whose names are lost but whose struggles echo in silence. So rest your mind, for we are only at the beginning. This is the story of why life, in all its beauty and hardship, so often seemed to conspire against smart women in medieval times. And yet within that struggle there was resilience, a quiet persistence that kept their knowledge alive, waiting for centuries until the world might be ready to listen. And so, with the gentle rhythm of history cradling us, let us slowly step deeper into this tale. The past awaits, and it has much to whisper. Let us drift deeper now into the medieval world where daily life pressed its weight upon women, and intellect often became both a secret blessing and a hidden curse. To understand why life was so unkind to smart women in this age, we must first trace the outlines of their environment. The rhythm of the towns and villages, the rules of the manor, the ever-watchful eyes of the church, and the narrow paths that society laid before them. Close your eyes, if you will, and imagine the hum of a medieval village. The morning begins with the crow of roosters, the clanging of iron from a smithy, and the chatter of women gathering water from the well. The air smells of damp earth and smoke from hearth fires. Children chase one another in the mud, their laughter echoing through streets lined with timbered houses. For most women, life was bound to this cycle of labour: cooking, cleaning, tending children, and working fields or looms. To be practical was expected. To be clever beyond those tasks was unusual. The church, with its vast influence, offered a moral framework that defined what a woman should and should not be. She was to be modest, obedient, silent in the presence of men, and devoted to her family or her convent. The figure of the Virgin Mary stood as an ideal, pure, humble, and gentle. To step outside that model, to be too outspoken, too curious, too challenging, was to risk being compared not to Mary, but to Eve. And Eve, in the medieval imagination, was forever linked to temptation, sin, and downfall. Within this structure, education was a treasure, carefully guarded, often locked away from women's reach. While noble boys might be sent to monasteries or universities, noble girls were more often trained in household management, embroidery, and courtly manners. Peasant girls, of course, had little chance at any schooling at all, for their days were filled with toil from dawn until dusk. Yet here and there, exceptions bloomed like wildflowers in unexpected cracks of stone. A father might, in rare affection, teach his daughter to read. A brother might share scraps of knowledge from his lessons. A convent might allow an unusually gifted novice to study beyond the basics. It was in these rare places that sparks of intellect glowed, but they glowed under constant threat of being extinguished. For cleverness was not celebrated in women as it was in men. It was scrutinised. A man who displayed wit was admired. A woman who did the same was often ridiculed, distrusted, or branded unnatural. Even her physical appearance could become part of the judgment. A woman too beautiful and clever might be seen as dangerous, a seductress who wielded intellect like a weapon. A woman plain and clever might be mocked, as though her sharp mind were compensation for a lack of charm. The constraints reached into the heart of family life as well. A smart daughter could complicate her family's future. Parents often measured their daughter's value by the marriages they could secure. But intelligence did not always make for a pliant bride. A girl who spoke her mind or questioned her place might scare away suitors. Worse still, if she outshone her husband in knowledge or wit, it could be seen as a humiliation for him, and by extension, for the entire household. Many families chose to quietly curb their daughters' learning, not from cruelty, but from fear of the social consequences. Even in noble courts where poetry, music, and debate flourished, the roles of women were tightly scripted. They might participate in courtly love traditions, write verses, or compose songs, but always under the veil of romance and entertainment, not serious scholarship. Their contributions were often dismissed as diversions rather than genuine intellectual work. A woman's cleverness was permitted only if it was charming, light, and safely non-threatening. Anything beyond that was met with unease, and hovering always was the looming danger of association with magic and heresy. Knowledge of herbs and healing could make a woman useful in her village, but if misfortune struck, if a child died, if a crop failed, if sickness spread, those same skills could turn against her. Suddenly, she might be accused of consorting with dark forces, of knowing too much about nature, of meddling where no woman should. Countless wise women, midwives and healers bore this double-edged fate. Revered when their remedies worked, reviled when they did not. The paradox was sharpest in convents, where women sometimes found space to cultivate learning. Within cloister walls, nuns copied manuscripts, composed prayers, and preserved fragments of ancient wisdom. But even here, their autonomy was fragile. Abbesses had to tread carefully, ensuring that their communities remained within the bounds of orthodoxy. A nun who strayed too far in her interpretations of scripture, or who displayed too much confidence in her insights, could face discipline or censure. Yet within those stone walls, the seeds of women's intellectual resilience were planted, surviving even when storms of suspicion raged outside. For smart women in medieval times, the world was a narrow path lined with sharp thorns. They walked it cautiously, knowing that a single misstep could lead to ruin. Their stories are threaded with tension, between yearning and fear, between brilliance and silence. Every choice carried weight, to speak or remain quiet, to learn or to feign ignorance, to share their knowledge or conceal it like a hidden treasure. And yet, despite these limits they endured, some wrote, carefully choosing words that would not condemn them. Some taught, disguising their lessons in the language of devotion or poetry. Others whispered knowledge from mother to daughter, passing wisdom through generations like an heirloom too fragile to be displayed in public. They found ways to keep their intellect alive, though always in shadows, always with caution. It is within this atmosphere of opportunity glimpsed but denied, of minds restless yet restrained, that our story deepens. For as centuries passed, women who dared to be clever began to carve their names into history, each one a flicker of light in a world determined to keep them dimmed. Their struggles, their resilience, and their quiet rebellions are what we will turn to next, as we move from the general air of suspicion into the specific lives of those who dared to challenge it. Let us now step closer, away from the general tapestry of medieval society and into the intimate lives of women whose brilliance flickered like candlelight against the darkness of their age. These women, remembered in fragments of manuscripts and whispered in chronicles, dared to live with minds too wide for the narrow walls that confined them. Their names, though few, echo through the centuries as symbols of defiance, resilience, and the silent cost of being clever in a time that mistrusted such gifts. One of the most striking figures was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess born in the 12th century. From childhood, Hildegard experienced visions, luminous, overwhelming scenes she described as divine revelations. In an age where women's voices were silenced, her visions offered her a paradoxical shield. They allowed her to claim authority not as her own, but as something granted from God. Through this fragile protection, Hildegard composed music, wrote treatises on medicine and natural science, and corresponded with kings and popes. Yet even she, with her extraordinary influence, was careful to couch her intellect in humility. She often described herself as weak, frail, and unworthy, presenting her wisdom as something merely passed through her, never from her. Her brilliance had to be disguised as obedience, her authority cloaked in submission. Consider too Héloïse, the famed scholar and lover of Peter Abelard in 12th century France. Héloïse was renowned for her command of Latin, her philosophical insight, and her eloquence in debate. She and Abelard exchanged letters that still survive, letters that pulse with both intellectual fire and deep human longing. Yet for all her genius, Héloïse's life was shaped by the cruelty of circumstance. Their secret love, once revealed, ended in violence. Abelard was attacked, Héloïse was forced into a convent, and though she became a respected abbess, her writings reveal a woman whose mind burned far beyond the narrow life imposed upon her. She longed not just for love, but for recognition of her intellect, and yet she knew the world would never grant it freely. These women, and others like them, illustrate the precarious balance clever women were forced to strike. Their intelligence could not be too bold, too visible, lest it invite condemnation. but neither could it be fully hidden, for their minds were restless, their spirits too alive. They lived in a constant dance between revelation and concealment, between daring and survival. It was not only in monasteries or noble courts that smart women existed. In the bustling towns amidst merchants and craftsmen, there were women who quietly defied the boundaries of their roles. Some became skilled in business, managing shops and estates with shrewd calculation. Widows, in particular, often found themselves thrust into positions of authority, handling accounts, negotiating with traders, making decisions once reserved for men. Their success, however, was always tentative. A widow who proved too competent might be pressured into remarriage, her independence swiftly curtailed. If she resisted, she risked gossip or worse, accusations of greed, witchcraft, or unnatural ambition. In villages, women who mastered the knowledge of healing herbs occupied a similarly uncertain space. They were valued when they eased childbirth, cured fevers, or prepared poultices for wounds. But when illness lingered or when misfortune struck, suspicion turned quickly. Knowledge of plants could so easily be reframed as meddling with forces beyond the natural, a sign of pact with the devil. What was once wisdom became danger, and many such women faced trials, punishments, or banishment for their skills. These stories reveal a broader truth, that clever women of the medieval world were constantly negotiating the fine line between necessity and threat. Society needed them, needed their healing, their management, their insight, but also feared them. It feared what might happen if their intelligence broke free from the chains of obedience. We must also remember that most women who were clever left no trace in written history. Their lives unfolded in silence, their ideas whispered only to trusted confidants, their knowledge passed down in secret. They were mothers teaching daughters how to read a prayer book in secret, or wives quietly assisting husbands in accounts, or nuns copying manuscripts without leaving their own names in the margins. For every Hildegard, every Heloise, there were thousands whose stories are lost, though their struggles were no less real. The tragedy lies not only in what these women endured, but in what the world lost. Imagine the sciences, the arts, the philosophies that might have flourished if women's intellect had been welcomed rather than suppressed. Imagine the voices that might have reshaped theology, medicine, literature, voices silenced before they could ever speak fully. The medieval world feared that clever women might disrupt its fragile order, and so it stifled them. In doing so, it stifled itself. And yet, even amid this suppression, women found ways to leave their mark. Their songs, their poems, their letters, their remedies. Fragments of brilliance slipped through the cracks, preserved against the odds. Each fragment reminds us that intelligence, no matter how fiercely resisted, finds ways to endure. As the centuries turned, the tension only grew sharper. Universities rose as new centres of learning, but they closed their gates firmly against women. The very places where knowledge blossomed became fortresses of exclusion. For smart women, the challenge was not merely to learn, but to do so in a world that insisted they had no place among scholars. And it is to this exclusion, to the halls of universities and the voices silenced outside them, that our journey now turns. Let us now walk through the stone arches of medieval universities, those proud new centres of knowledge that rose across Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, and others began as gatherings of scholars, soon swelling into institutions that would define the intellectual life of the continent for centuries. Their halls rang with debates in Latin, their libraries held carefully guarded manuscripts, and their cloisters became hothouses of philosophy, law, and theology. To walk within their walls was to join a brotherhood of learning, a fraternity bound by privilege. And it was, quite literally, a brotherhood. For women, these doors remained closed, bolted by custom, law, and prejudice. A clever young woman in the Middle Ages might hear rumours of these universities, how scholars argued Aristotle's logic late into the night, how students copied text by candlelight, how professors stood before crowds reciting the wisdom of the ancients. She might dream of walking those corridors herself, of asking questions, of being part of those debates. But for her, the vision remained a dream. Universities declared themselves places for men only, their charters often explicitly excluding women. Knowledge here was a guarded treasure, meant to be shaped and transmitted by male hands. This exclusion was not accidental. It was rooted in layers of belief and fear. Theologians of the time often cited the supposed weakness of women's minds, their susceptibility to temptation, and their distraction by domestic duties as reasons they could not be admitted. They feared that women in studying rhetoric might use it to manipulate, in studying law might defy, in studying theology might misinterpret. The image of Eve haunted their reasoning still. Curiosity equated with disobedience, learning with danger. To open the gates to women was, in their minds, to invite disorder. And so women who thirsted for education had to seek it elsewhere. Some managed to find private tutors, men willing to teach them in secret or in the safety of their homes. Others turned to convents, where they might study scripture, music, or medicine within the narrow boundaries allowed. A few disguised themselves. Tales whispered of girls dressing as boys to slip unnoticed into lecture halls, though such stories blur the line between legend and fact. Whether or not they happened often, the very persistence of these stories reveals the deep yearning for access and the starkness of its denial. The exclusion had consequences far beyond personal frustration. It meant that entire fields developed with women's voices absent. Theology became a male conversation about the soul and salvation, with little thought for how women experienced faith. Law was shaped without consideration of women's rights or perspectives, often codifying their subordination. Medicine advanced through texts written by men who studied the body as though it were always male, relegating women's knowledge of childbirth and herbs to the margins, dismissing it as superstition. By keeping women out of universities, medieval society ensured that its intellectual record would be incomplete, distorted, tilted heavily toward one half of humanity. But clever women did not simply vanish in the face of exclusion. They carved out spaces at the edges, refusing to let the walls of universities be the final word. In Italy, women like Betticia Gozzardini and Novella d'Andrea, rare exceptions, are said to have lectured at Bologna, though often hidden behind curtains so students would not be distracted by their presence. In Paris, Christine de Pizan emerged as a powerful voice, not through a university, but through her own pen. Widowed and left to provide for her children, she turned to writing, producing works that challenged the misogyny of her time. Her book of the City of Ladies created a symbolic refuge where women's intelligence could flourish, even if reality denied them space. For most, however, the path was quieter, less recorded. They might learn to read enough to follow religious texts, whispering prayers over pages lit by candlelight. They might memorize songs or verses, storing knowledge in memory when ink and parchment were out of reach. They might sit beside brothers during lessons, catching fragments of Latin and logic, absorbing what was never meant for them. Each act of learning was a defiance, small but profound, against the walls that said no. This absence from universities also deepened the suspicion surrounding educated women. Since they had no official path to learning, any woman who displayed unusual knowledge appeared suspect. Where had she learned it? Who had taught her? Was it proper? Was it even natural? And so the cycle of suspicion tightened. Denied formal education, women who learned in informal ways were accused of stepping outside their place, reinforcing the very prejudices that excluded them. Yet even as they were excluded, women could not be erased from the intellectual life of the age. Their influence ran through quieter channels, in the letters they exchanged, in the poems they composed, in the medical advice they offered, in the records of households they managed. Knowledge, after all, is not confined to universities alone. It lives in kitchens, in gardens, in songs, in whispered conversations at dusk. And there, women left their imprint, shaping understanding in ways too subtle for official chronicles to fully capture. Still, the injustice was clear. While men debated Aristotle beneath vaulted ceilings, women listened from shadows, or not at all. While men inscribed their names in academic rolls, women's names faded into obscurity. The intellectual wealth of the age was hoarded, and half the world was told it had no claim to it. It is in this silence, the silence of voices excluded, that we can begin to sense the weight of what was lost. The brilliance of medieval universities shines in history, but it shines unevenly, casting long shadows where women's minds were forced to linger outside, and in those shadows, resentment, longing, and quiet resistance grew. As centuries pressed onward, this exclusion fed into broader patterns of suspicion, for if a woman was not permitted to learn in proper halls, then her knowledge must come from improper sources. This is how slowly the educated woman and the so-called witch became entangled in the medieval imagination. It is to that entanglement, the dark suspicion that intelligence and sorcery walked hand in hand, that our journey now turns. The medieval imagination was a place where boundaries blurred, where faith and fear wove themselves into the fabric of daily life, where the unseen seemed as real as the tangible, and where knowledge itself could be mistaken for sorcery. To be a woman with a quick mind, a sharp memory, or an unusual understanding of the natural world was to walk a dangerous line. For in the eyes of many, there was but a short step between being clever and being accused of witchcraft. Imagine a small village at dusk, smoke curling from chimneys, livestock gathered into pens, and villagers settling in for the night. In one cottage, a woman kneels by her hearth, mixing herbs into a poultice for a child's fever. Her knowledge comes from years of observation, from watching plants grow, from listening to elders, from trial and error passed down like inheritance. To the family she heals, she is a blessing. But to those who mistrust her, she is something else. A woman who knows too much, who speaks with too much authority, who dares to wield knowledge without the blessing of priest or physician. The line between healer and witch was perilously thin. Men studied medicine in universities, their credentials giving them authority. Women, barred from those halls, relied on tradition, intuition, and observation. But when their remedies worked, they seemed uncanny. And when they failed, the blame could be catastrophic. A crop that withered, a storm that struck, a baby who did not survive birth. All these could be twisted into accusations. The woman who had once been sought out for her wisdom could quickly become the object of suspicion, whispers growing until they swelled into accusations of sorcery. The church, meanwhile, nurtured an ambivalent stance toward women's knowledge. It praised devotion, chastity, and obedience, but it distrusted women who appeared too independent in thought. Official doctrine often painted women as more vulnerable to the devil's temptations, more prone to error, more easily swayed by dark forces. When whispers of witchcraft emerged, they found fertile ground in this theology. It was all too easy to believe that a clever woman, one who challenged men's authority or who lived alone and self-sufficient, might indeed be in league with something sinister. This suspicion was not confined to rural healers. Even learned women within convents could face it. A nun who displayed unusual theological insight might be revered as divinely inspired, but she might just as easily be suspected of pride, her visions scrutinized for signs of heresy. Hildegard of Bingen, whose visions we have already glimpsed, escaped such charges in part because she cloaked her work in humility and claimed it as revelation from God. But others were not so fortunate. Mystics and visionaries sometimes found their writings condemned, their insights labelled dangerous. A woman who spoke too boldly of divine mysteries risked being accused of stepping beyond the place allotted to her, and therefore of consorting with false spirits. The tension deepened as Europe entered the later Middle Ages. Fear of heresy grew, and with it, fear of women whose knowledge defied simple explanation. Manuals began to circulate among inquisitors, blending theology with superstition, and painting pictures of witches who made pacts with the devil, who flew through the night, who spread plague and misfortune. Though many of these images were exaggerated or imagined, they cast long shadows. Into those shadows fell countless women whose only crime was to be too clever, too skilled, or too independent. It is important to understand how fear worked in these communities. It was rarely about the woman herself, but about what she represented, a challenge to the fragile order of a world constantly threatened by disease, famine, and war. When disaster struck, people sought reasons, and the clever woman was a convenient explanation. Why had the cow stopped giving milk? Perhaps the healer had cursed it. Why had the harvest failed? Perhaps the midwife with her secret herbs had called down ill fortune. Fear demanded a scapegoat, and smart women provided one, precisely because they stood out. This suspicion also reveals the paradox of women's roles. Society depended on their knowledge of healing, of childbirth, of household management, but also feared the very same knowledge. It wanted their skills, but not their independence. It craved their remedies, but distrusted the power behind them. Women were caught in this double bind, praised when they served, condemned when they appeared too self-reliant. The irony is that women's wisdom was often more grounded in reality than the medicine practiced in universities. While male physicians debated humours and astrological alignments, women tested herbs, observed symptoms, and built remedies from lived experience. Their knowledge was practical, experiential, sometimes far more effective than theory-heavy treatments. Yet because it lacked institutional sanction, it was branded suspect, and women who wielded it risked persecution. The suspicion of sorcery did more than endanger women's lives. It silenced their voices. To speak too freely, to display too much confidence, to claim knowledge beyond the expected, all became dangerous. Many women learned to hide their intellect, to feign ignorance, to present themselves as modest and unknowing, even when their minds brimmed with insight. This enforced silence stunted not only their lives, but the broader progress of society, which lost the benefit of their contributions. And yet, in quiet ways, women resisted. They shared remedies in whispers. They taught daughters and apprentices in secret. They disguised their writings with humility or allegory. Their knowledge lived on in margins and fragments, in traditions carried forward even when official voices tried to erase them. The very suspicion that sought to destroy their intellect ensured its survival, for it marked their ideas as powerful enough to be feared. As the centuries wore on, the image of the witch grew more terrifying, and the persecution of women intensified. But beneath that terror lies the truth, that what was feared was not merely magic, but the sight of women who knew too much, who thought too freely, who defied the narrow boundaries set for them. To understand why life was so difficult for smart women in the medieval age, we must linger here, in this entanglement of intellect and fear, of knowledge and accusation, of wisdom and danger. From this shadowed ground we will move onward to see how women themselves began to write back against the world that silenced them, how their pens, quiet yet determined, carved spaces of resistance in manuscripts, poems and letters that survived against all odds. Let us turn now to the fragile but enduring world of the written word, where women who were denied pulpits and podiums found refuge in ink and parchment. In an age when their voices were unwelcome in universities or courts, writing became one of the few ways they could preserve their thoughts, their grief, their questions, and their quiet rebellions. To write was to resist forgetting. It was to leave a trace in a world that often insisted on erasing them. Imagine the dim glow of a candle in a small chamber, the scratching of a quill across parchment, and a woman hunched over the page, her fingers cramped from hours of labour. She knows that her words may never be read widely, that they might be dismissed or condemned, but she writes anyway, because to her, writing is both survival and sanctuary. It allows her to shape a world where she has a voice, even if that world exists only between the lines of a manuscript. One such woman was Christine de Pizan, born in Venice in 1364 but raised in Paris. Left widowed with young children, Christine turned to her pen as her livelihood. Unlike many of her contemporaries, she wrote not in Latin but in the French vernacular, making her works accessible to a broader audience. She became one of the first women in Europe to earn her living as a writer. Her words were not timid. She confronted the misogyny embedded in the literature of her time, most famously in her book of the City of Ladies, where she constructed an allegorical city populated by history's great women. Within its walls, female intellect was celebrated, protected and honoured. Her vision was radical, that women's value lay not in their silence, but in their wisdom, their creativity, their courage. Christine's example shows how women used writing not only to express themselves, but to counter the narratives written against them. For centuries, male authors had painted women as weak, deceitful, or dangerous. Through her pen, Christine began to dismantle those images, replacing them with portraits of women as thinkers, leaders, and creators. It was a quiet revolution, conducted not on battlefields but in manuscripts, yet its echoes still resound. But not all women wrote for public recognition. Many wrote in secrecy, composing letters, poems, or meditations meant for private eyes. Héloïse, whose tragic love affair with Peter Abelard marked her life, left behind letters that remain some of the most powerful voices of the medieval era. Her correspondence reveals not only the depth of her love, but the sharpness of her mind, her philosophical reflections, interwoven with her personal anguish. Though forced into convent life, she continued to write with an intensity that refused to be silenced. Other women, cloistered in convents, wrote visions, prayers, and mystical reflections. Figures like Julian of Norwich in England recorded revelations that blended theology with deep empathy. Her famous declaration, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," emerged from a society scarred by plague and despair. While male theologians often emphasized sin and punishment, Julian's writings leaned toward comfort and compassion. Her perspective, shaped by her experience as a woman, as a caretaker, as a survivor, offered something profoundly different, something the world would have lacked had her voice been silenced. Writing was not without danger. Women who expressed themselves too boldly risked accusations of arrogance, heresy, or impropriety. Many prefaced their works with declarations of humility. "I am but a weak woman, unworthy to write such things." These disclaimers were not merely convention, they were shields, ways to protect themselves from suspicion. Beneath such humble phrases, however, their words often pulsed with confidence, insight, and quiet defiance. Even in the margins of manuscripts, women left traces. Sometimes a name, a small comment, or a sketch revealed the presence of female scribes, hidden in plain sight. These fragments remind us that women were not absent from the world of learning, even if their roles were minimized. Their hands copied texts, their voices shaped prayers, their thoughts slipped into the cracks of history. What makes their writings so moving is not only their rarity, but their tone. They often reveal an acute awareness of the constraints around them. Christine de Pizan argued openly against misogyny because she recognized how pervasive it was. Héloïse wrote with anguish because she knew her choices had been stolen from her. Julian of Norwich cloaked her visions in the language of devotion because she knew theology was a perilous ground for women. Their words are layered, expressions of thought, veils of caution, and sparks of rebellion all at once. To read these texts today is to glimpse both suffering and resilience. It is to hear voices that were almost silenced but managed to endure. And it is to feel the weight of absence, for every Christine, Héloïse, or Julian whose words survived, there were countless others whose writings were lost, destroyed, or never even attempted out of fear. Their silence is as much a part of the story as the voices that remain. The paradox deepens. Women were denied universities, excluded from debates, silenced in councils, and yet through writing they shaped thought in ways their contemporaries could not fully erase. Their works, fragile as parchment, crossed centuries, whispering to us across time. They remind us that intellect finds ways to endure, even when pushed into shadows. And yet, for all the power of the pen, the daily lives of smart women remained burdened. Outside the rare sanctuary of ink and parchment, they had to navigate marriages, households, and communities where their cleverness was not welcomed. To see how intellect played out in the ordinary rhythms of family and domestic life, we must now step from the cloisters and study chambers into kitchens, gardened halls where women's wit found both use and danger in the most everyday of spaces. Step with me now from the echoing halls of monasteries and the fragile pages of manuscripts into the hum of everyday life, where clever women faced trials not in debates of theology or philosophy, but in kitchens, gardens, and households. For here, in the ordinary rhythms of family and community, intelligence was both a hidden tool and a quiet burden. Imagine the interior of a medieval home. The air is thick with the scent of bread baking on the hearth, smoke curling into the rafters, herbs hanging to dry along the beams. A woman tends to a pot, stirring with practiced skill, while her eyes dart to the accounts she keeps in her head. How much grain remains, how many chickens have laid, what debts are owed, and when her husband must make payments to the Lord. These calculations require shrewdness, memory, and foresight. A clever woman could manage a household with remarkable efficiency, ensuring her family's survival through lean harvests or unexpected demands. But Cleverness in the household was a double-edged gift. For while it made families prosper, it could also invite unease. A wife who corrected her husband's sums, who negotiated too well in the market, or who advised him too forcefully might be branded sharp-tongued, domineering, or unnatural. Society expected wives to be submissive, yet it quietly relied on their intelligence. And so women learned to hide their cleverness beneath humility, to couch their advice in gentle phrases, to let their husbands appear to lead while they quietly steered the course. Marriage itself was a complicated arena for intelligent women. Many unions were arranged with little concern for compatibility, and a clever wife might find herself tethered to a man uninterested in her mind. Her wit could be a source of tension, her quick words mistaken for defiance. Some women learned to use their intelligence subtly, turning it into charm or persuasion. Others endured frustration in silence, their thoughts bottled up in private prayers or whispered confidences with trusted friends. In this way, the very brilliance that could have enriched a partnership often became a burden to bear alone. Motherhood, too, presented both opportunity and peril. A mother might use her intellect to guide her children, teaching them letters or prayers, instilling wisdom through stories. Yet here again, boundaries pressed in. Too much ambition for her sons might be seen as meddling. Too much attention to her daughter's learning could be considered wasteful or improper. Clever mothers passed down knowledge in quiet ways through songs, through games, through the teaching of practical skills that doubled as lessons in memory, calculation, and judgment. Their classrooms were gardens, kitchens, and spinning rooms, where intellect disguised itself as domestic labour. Beyond the family, women often held roles in local economies. Markets were bustling places, filled with the chatter of bargaining, the weighing of goods, the swift calculation of prices. Women sold bread, ale, cloth, herbs, and countless other wares. To succeed required sharp wits and resilience, especially when dealing with merchants eager to take advantage. But once again, a woman who proved too shrewd risked being resented. Profit in her hands could be twisted into greed. Her success might draw whispers that she had used dishonest means, or worse, witchcraft. The very qualities that allowed her to thrive could also mark her for suspicion. Widowhood offered a rare moment of independence for women, but even here, intellect was treated warily. A widow who managed her late husband's estate with skill might earn admiration, but she might also draw pressure to remarry so that a man could take charge. If she resisted, preferring to manage her affairs alone, she risked being branded as stubborn or untrustworthy. Clever widows who used their freedom to expand businesses or estates walked a fine line, celebrated when successful, but criticised for stepping beyond the roles deemed proper. Among neighbours and in villages, clever women often became the ones others sought out for advice, whether for household matters, disputes or remedies. Yet their influence was informal, never officially recognised, always vulnerable to suspicion. A clever word at the wrong time, a suggestion that contradicted a man of standing, could spark resentment. Their wisdom was welcome only so long as it did not challenge the authority of those around them. What emerges from these patterns is a quiet tragedy. Women's intelligence was essential for survival, yet it was rarely acknowledged or rewarded. Instead, it was wrapped in caution, disguised as obedience, softened with humility. A clever woman in her home might save her family from ruin, but she would not be praised for her wit. She would be praised for her piety, her patience, her virtue. Intellect had to hide behind masks, its sharpness dulled to keep it from cutting too deeply against the grain of expectation. And yet there was resilience in this hidden cleverness. Women created informal networks of knowledge, sharing tips about remedies, recipes or household strategies. They taught one another in kitchens, fields and spinning rooms. They built webs of wisdom that bypassed official institutions, ensuring that practical intelligence endured even in the face of suppression. Their contributions were invisible to chroniclers, but they shaped the survival of families and communities across centuries. Still, the tension never eased. A clever word could save, but it could also condemn. A wise suggestion could build prosperity, but it could also spark envy. Women lived within this paradox daily, navigating it with caution and grace. Their intelligence was both their greatest strength and their most dangerous liability. From these ordinary spaces, let us move now to the extraordinary moments when clever women stepped beyond domestic life and entered courts, salons, and stages of influence. For while most endured silence within homes and markets, a rare few carved paths into the wider world of politics and power, places where their intellect shone brightly but where the risks grew even greater. Let us now step away from the small hearths of villages and into the glittering courts of medieval Europe, where power and politics swirled like a restless storm. Here too, clever women found themselves both valued and feared, their intelligence both a weapon and a danger. In royal chambers and noble halls, where alliances were made and kingdoms shaped, women's voices sometimes rang out more boldly, but never without consequence. Picture a great hall draped in banners, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meats and beeswax candles. Nobles gather at long tables, their voices carrying in a chorus of ambition and rivalry. At the head of the hall sits a queen, adorned in jewels, her posture graceful, her smile measured. Behind her calm eyes works a mind that weighs every word, every glance, every silence. For a queen or a noblewoman, survival often depended not only on beauty or lineage, but on intellect, the ability to read a room, to sense betrayal before it struck, to maneuver among factions without ever appearing too bold. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women of the 12th century. She was intelligent, ambitious, and outspoken, qualities that made her both admired and feared. As Queen of France and later of England, she wielded influence rarely granted to women of her time. She patronised poets, guided political decisions, and even led troops during the Second Crusade. Yet her cleverness was a double-edged sword. Chroniclers often described her as dangerous, meddling, or willful. When her marriage to Henry II of England soured, she was imprisoned for years, in part because her sharp mind and political manoeuvring were seen as threats to his authority. Clever noblewomen often became the unseen hands shaping politics. Marriages arranged for alliances did not end women's influence. Rather, they placed them at the heart of diplomacy. Letters, gifts, and whispered counsel became tools as powerful as swords. Some women, like Blanche of Castile in France, served as regents ruling on behalf of young sons. Blanche proved herself a shrewd leader, guiding France through crises, negotiating treaties, and keeping noble factions in check. Her intelligence preserved stability, yet even she was often described by contemporaries with suspicion, as though her competence were unnatural for her sex. At courts across Europe, noblewomen were expected to be ornaments of beauty and grace, skilled in music, poetry, and manners. But those who displayed too much wit risked drawing ire. Courtly love traditions celebrated women as muses, inspiring men's poetry and valour, but rarely as thinkers in their own right. A clever remark could delight, but it could just as easily be twisted into arrogance. To survive, intelligent women at court often disguised their brilliance in charm, weaving their insights into flattery, couching their strategies in softness. The dangers were heightened by the constant presence of gossip. In the rarefied air of courts, where reputations were as fragile as glass, whispers could destroy a woman who appeared too clever, too influential. A queen who counselled her husband might be accused of manipulation. A lady who spoke boldly in gatherings might be branded scheming or deceitful. Clever women learned to guard their tongues, to speak in riddles, to couch wisdom in humour or song, to offer counsel privately rather than publicly. The dance of intellect became a performance, carefully choreographed to avoid missteps. And yet, despite these dangers, clever women left their mark. They shaped cultural life through patronage, supporting poets, musicians, and philosophers who might otherwise have gone unheard. They used their wit in diplomacy, smoothing tensions between rival lords or kingdoms. They guided their children, training princes and princesses who would one day rule. Their influence often remained invisible in chronicles written by men, but it pulsed beneath the surface of history, steering the course of kingdoms. Still, even the highest-born women could never escape suspicion. The same qualities that made them effective, intelligence, foresight, political acumen, were the qualities most feared. When things went wrong, blame often fell upon them. If a king faltered, perhaps his queen had whispered the wrong counsel. If a rebellion rose, perhaps a clever woman had stirred it. Cleverness became a liability disguised as a virtue, welcomed in times of need but resented once the crisis passed. This pattern shows itself again and again. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, Isabel of France, each a woman of sharp mind, each both revered and reviled, each remembered as much for controversy as for achievement. They reveal how intellect in women was tolerated only so long as it served men's ambitions. The moment it seemed to stand apart, to challenge or overshadow, it was treated as dangerous, unnatural, even treasonous. What makes their stories compelling is not only their triumphs, but their endurance. They walked tightropes stretched across the chasms of politics, balancing intelligence with caution, ambition with humility. Their survival depended on constant vigilance, for one false step could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. Yet they persisted, carving out influence where none was meant for them, shaping history even as history tried to silence them. From these glittering halls, we begin to see the full paradox of clever women in the medieval age, celebrated in private, distrusted in public, needed for their wisdom, punished for their independence. But beyond courts and castles, another stage awaited. The pulpit, the chapel, the space of religion where women's intellect met perhaps its fiercest resistance. For here, in the very heart of faith, clever women found themselves both drawn to the mysteries of God and trapped by the suspicion that their insights were dangerous to the soul. Now let us move from the glittering courts of queens and noble women into the cloistered silence of religion, where faith and intellect entwined in ways both beautiful and perilous. For in the medieval world, religion was not simply belief, it was the very framework of life, shaping law, morality, and identity. And within that framework, women who dared to think deeply, to write boldly, or to question freely, found themselves in a struggle more subtle and more dangerous than any waged in politics. Imagine a convent, its stone walls enclosing gardens and chapels, the air filled with the sound of chanting voices. For many women, convents offered the only doorway into a life where learning was possible. Within these walls, they might read scripture, study music, or copy manuscripts. Here, they could escape the demands of marriage and childbearing, dedicating their lives to God. For some, this seclusion was a sanctuary where intellect could bloom. And yet, even here, suspicion lingered. A woman's devotion was praised when it was humble, when it was quiet. But if her learning grew too visible, if her words carried too much weight, she risked being accused of pride, heresy, or worse. Consider Hildegard of Bingen once more, the abbess whose visions granted her unusual authority. Her music, her writings on medicine, her theological reflections, all these flowed from a mind that brimmed with brilliance. But Hildegard knew the peril of appearing too bold. Again and again she cloaked her intellect in disclaimers, insisting she was but a frail vessel through which God spoke. Her humility was both genuine and strategic, a shield against those who might accuse her of overstepping. Without it, her voice might have been silenced, her works condemned. Other women were not so fortunate. Marguerite Porete, a French mystic of the late 13th century, wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, a daring text that described the soul's union with God in ways that bypassed the authority of priests. Her words were powerful, lyrical, and unsettling to those who guarded orthodoxy. For her boldness, she was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake in 1310. Her fate is a chilling reminder of the risks women faced when their intellect ventured too far beyond the lines drawn for them. Mystical visions, so often a refuge for women, could be both shield and snare. A woman who claimed visions might be revered as holy, her words cherished as divine insight. But the same visions could be judged delusions or temptations from the devil. The line between saint and heretic was thin, and clever women who articulated their experiences with too much eloquence often found themselves treading it. Julian of Norwich, whose gentle words still comfort readers today, survived perhaps because her theology leaned toward compassion rather than confrontation. Others, less cautious, were not spared. The Church's unease with female intellect was rooted in deep tradition. Early theologians like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrote of women as weaker, more susceptible to error, less capable of reason. These ideas permeated sermons and teachings, reinforcing the belief that women should listen, not teach, obey, not lead. A woman who displayed learning or spiritual authority appeared to challenge not only social norms but divine order itself. In such a climate, even small acts of intellectual independence became acts of defiance. And yet, despite the risks, convents and religious life preserved much of what women's intellect could achieve. In scriptoriums, nuns copied texts with care, their anonymous hands ensuring the survival of works that shaped Western thought. In gardens, they cultivated herbs and recorded remedies, blending devotion with science. In letters, they corresponded with bishops, scholars, and rulers, offering counsel that was sometimes heeded, sometimes ignored. Their contributions were woven into the fabric of religious life, even if history often chose not to name them. The paradox here is striking. Religion offered women their greatest chance at learning, and yet it also placed the greatest chains upon them. To think was to risk, to write was to expose, to speak was to endanger oneself. Women who managed to carve space for intellect within faith did so with caution, humility, and often at great personal cost. Their brilliance had to wear the mask of devotion, their wisdom softened into piety. And so, within chapels and cloisters, another layer of silence was added to women's lives. Cleverness could not be denied entirely. It flickered in hymns, in prayers, in visions, but it could not be celebrated openly either. It existed always on the edge, tolerated but never fully embraced. This tension shaped not only the fate of individuals, but the larger course of society. When women were denied the chance to study theology freely, the church lost voices that might have offered new perspectives on compassion, justice, and community. The absence of women's voices in councils and doctrines left a void, one filled instead with suspicion and fear. For every Hildegard or Julian whose words endured, there were many whose voices were silenced before they could ever be heard. To understand why life was so hard for smart women in the medieval world, we must see how faith and fear walked hand in hand, how intellect was both nourished and punished within religion. And from these cloisters, let us turn now to the shadowed streets beyond, where whispers of women's cleverness spilled into popular imagination, into tales, ballads, and folklore that shaped how society at large saw the very idea of a woman who thought too much. Step now with me beyond the cloisters and courts into the realm of stories, the tales told by firelight, the ballads sung in marketplaces, the legends whispered from parent to child. For here, in folklore and popular imagination, the image of the clever woman took root, often twisted into caricature, sometimes celebrated, but more often feared. These tales reveal as much about medieval society as chronicles or laws, for they show how ordinary people imagined the place of women's intellect, not as blessing, but as threat. Imagine a winter evening in a small village. Families gather around a hearth, shadows flickering on the walls as an elder begins a story. The tale is of a woman who outwitted her husband, or of a witch who tricked men into ruin, or of a dangerous beauty whose clever tongue brought disaster. Laughter, unease, and moral lessons mingle in the telling. Such stories were more than entertainment, they were guides shaping how listeners viewed the world. And in these guides, a pattern emerges. Clever women were not heroines, but warnings. The medieval imagination delighted in tales of trickster women. Ballads and fabliaux, short, often bawdy stories, depicted wives outsmarting their husbands, women deceiving priests, or young maidens using wit to secure their desires. These stories could be humorous, even liberating in their playful subversion of authority. But beneath the laughter lay an undercurrent of suspicion. The clever woman was rarely portrayed as wise or noble. She was sly, deceitful, or dangerous. Her wit was something to laugh at, but also to guard against. In folklore, the figure of the witch grew steadily more menacing. Old tales of wise women and healers gradually merged with fears of sorcery, until cleverness itself became suspect. Stories told of women who brewed potions, whispered incantations, or transformed into animals. These tales captured the fascination and fear of a world that relied on women's knowledge, but also distrusted it. They became cautionary myths, teaching listeners that women who knew too much were to be shunned, watched, or punished. Even in more elevated literature, the pattern held. Consider the legends of Arthurian romance. Women like Morgan Le Fay were portrayed as powerful and intelligent, but their intelligence was often framed as dark, manipulative, or destructive. Morgan, skilled in magic, became the archetype of the dangerous sorceress, her wit and independence cast as threats to male heroes. Meanwhile, women who embodied obedience and gentleness, like Guinevere or Elaine, were idealized even when their stories ended in tragedy. The contrast was stark. Cleverness in women was linked to peril, while virtue was linked to submission. Folk proverbs and sayings reinforce these ideas. A woman's tongue is her sword, some would say, or better a foolish wife than a clever one. These phrases distilled cultural anxieties into memorable lines, teaching each generation that a smart woman was more burden than blessing. Such sayings shaped expectations, seeping into daily life until they felt like common sense. And yet, folklore also carried traces of resistance. Hidden in certain tales were glimpses of admiration for clever women. Stories of maidens who solved riddles, queens who offered wise counsel, or wives who saved their households with quick thinking reveal a quieter recognition of women's intelligence. But even these tales often framed such cleverness as extraordinary, exceptions to the rule, rather than qualities to be expected or welcomed. What these stories reveal is not simply misogyny, but fear. Fear of disorder, of disruption, of the overturning of hierarchies. In a world where men were expected to lead, a clever woman threatened the fragile balance of power. Folklore turned this fear into entertainment, disguising it with humour or horror, but its lessons were clear. Women who displayed wit beyond their place risked suspicion. Those who cloaked their intellect in obedience might survive. The impact of these tales extended far beyond the fireside. They seeped into how people interpreted real women's lives. A clever remark at a market, a skillful negotiation, or an unusual knowledge of herbs could be viewed through the lens of folklore, transforming everyday actions into signs of deceit or sorcery. In this way, stories did not just reflect fear, they reinforced it, making suspicion a natural response to female intelligence. And so, as much as courts, universities or churches, the realm of story shaped the boundaries of women's lives. Cleverness was tolerated only when it amused or served, otherwise it was twisted into vice. Women learned these lessons early, internalizing them, adjusting their words and actions to avoid becoming the subject of whispered tales. But even as folklore painted them as dangerous, clever women did not vanish. They endured in every corner of life, finding subtle ways to use their minds, to guide their families, to shape their communities. Their resilience remained, though always shadowed by suspicion. From the world of story, let us now return to the harder ground of history, to the economic and social shifts of the later Middle Ages, when trade expanded, towns grew, and new opportunities appeared. For in these changes, smart women sometimes found cracks in the walls that confined them, small spaces where their intellect could thrive, though never without risk. As we step into the later Middle Ages, the landscape begins to shift. Towns grow busier, markets more crowded, and trade expands across seas and continents. Merchants travel with goods from distant lands, guilds rise in influence, and the hum of commerce fills the air. In this world of bustling towns and changing economies, clever women found new spaces to act. But these spaces, like so many before, came with sharp edges of risk and suspicion. Picture a medieval town square. Stalls line the cobbled streets, their canopies bright against the grey stone buildings. The air smells of spices, wool, and fish brought in at dawn. Merchants call out their wares, bargaining voices mix with the clatter of carts, and children dart between the throngs. In this vibrant scene, women are everywhere, selling bread baked in home ovens, weaving cloth to display, brewing ale to quench thirst, or trading herbs and remedies. To succeed in such a market required not only stamina, but intelligence, quick calculation, sharp memory, persuasive speech, and many women had these in abundance. For some, trade was survival. Widows in particular often relied on their acumen to manage shops or continue their husbands' businesses. Records show women running breweries, cloth workshops, and small stalls. They balanced accounts, negotiated with suppliers, and trained apprentices. Their cleverness kept households afloat and ensured children could eat. In towns like London, Paris, and Bruges, women's economic activity was visible, vital, and undeniable. But visibility brought its dangers. Guilds, those powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants, often excluded women or limited their roles to assistants rather than masters. A clever woman who excelled too much could be seen as stepping beyond her place, threatening male colleagues. Regulations were written to curb their independence, rules that restricted how many apprentices a woman could take or that barred her from selling certain goods without a male guardian's oversight. Success itself could invite envy, and envy could turn into accusations of dishonesty, greed, or witchcraft. Even so, some women managed to leave a mark. In Flanders, women in the cloth trade gained reputations for their skill in weaving fine linens. In England, alewives brewed and sold beer that sustained entire communities. Their work required knowledge of measurement, timing, ingredients, and customer relations, skills of intellect disguised as labour. Yet while their contribution was immense, chroniclers rarely praised them. Instead, they appear in satirical poems or moralising sermons, mocked for greed or portrayed as cheats. Their cleverness in business, rather than admired, became another reason for suspicion. Within households too, economic life demanded sharp minds. Women often managed estates in their husband's absence, especially during wars or long trading journeys. They kept track of rents, oversaw workers, and made crucial decisions. Their authority was practical, born of necessity. Yet when men returned, this authority vanished, unacknowledged, as though the household had run itself. The intellect women exercised in these roles left little public trace, yet it shaped the survival of countless families. The church, as ever, cast its watchful eye on women's economic roles. Preachers often warned against women who were too clever in business, portraying them as temptresses who lured customers, or as greedy souls who prized profit over piety. The alewife became a stock figure in medieval satire, loud, shrewd, and dishonest. These caricatures, repeated in ballads and plays, reinforced the idea that women's cleverness in commerce was unnatural, dangerous, or laughable. Once again, intellect was tolerated only when hidden, not when flaunted. And yet, the changing economy could not erase women's presence. In every town and village, their work kept trade alive, their calculations balanced accounts, their negotiations shaped markets. Clever women carved niches within a system that tried to shut them out, their resilience woven into the very fabric of medieval commerce. They may not have been welcomed into guild halls, but they shaped markets in ways guilds could never fully control. This resilience, however, came with costs. Many women had to temper their wit, presenting themselves as modest and deferential even while conducting complex business. Others relied on male relatives as public faces, hiding their own influence behind husbands or sons. Their cleverness existed in shadows, disguised as obedience, even as it guided decisions. For those who dared to be too bold, consequences could be harsh. Fines, social ostracism, or worse, the whisper of witchcraft when misfortune struck. The paradox remained constant. Society needed women's intelligence in business and survival, but refused to acknowledge it openly. Clever women kept households fed, markets busy, and economies turning, all while being told their place was elsewhere. Their contributions were both indispensable and invisible. As towns grew into cities, this tension only deepened. The Renaissance was beginning to stir on the horizon, promising new ideas, new art, new science. But for women, the old chains held firm. They might glimpse opportunities in the cracks of change, but suspicion lingered, always ready to close in. From the marketplace, let us move now into the quieter but equally treacherous realm of marriage contracts, inheritance disputes, and legal records. For in the world of law, where cleverness was most needed to defend rights and property, women found themselves silenced once more, their intellect discounted, their voices rarely heard, their struggles buried in parchments written by others. Let us now step into the stern and shadowed chambers of law, where clever women found themselves tested not only by custom but by the written word of statutes and charters. Here, in the language of contracts, inheritance and disputes, intellect was both desperately needed and almost entirely denied. For law, in the medieval imagination, was a man's domain, to argue, to judge, to decide. Women entered its halls not as equals, but as dependents, forever spoken for rather than speaking. And yet, in the cracks of this system, smart women sometimes found ways to maneuver, their cleverness flickering even where silence was enforced. Picture a medieval courtroom, a wooden hall crowded with townsfolk, a lord or magistrate presiding, clerks scratching records onto parchment. The cases range from land disputes to theft, from quarrels over debts to accusations of slander. Men rise to argue their claims, but women, more often than not, must stand with lowered eyes, their words filtered through male guardians. A wife is represented by her husband, a daughter by her father, a widow perhaps by a son or male relative. To speak too boldly for oneself was frowned upon, even dangerous. Clever women, if they had arguments to make, learned to deliver them indirectly, through letters, through intermediaries, through calculated performances of humility. Inheritance law was one of the most treacherous fields. In many parts of Europe, women could inherit property, but their rights were fragile. A daughter might inherit only if there were no sons, and even then, her holdings could be claimed by her husband upon marriage. A widow might retain dower rights, a portion of her husband's estate, but often found herself pressured by in-laws or courts to surrender more than she was entitled. Here, cleverness was essential. The ability to remember promises, to produce documents, to recall the exact words of agreements. Many women, faced with legal battles, demonstrated remarkable acuity, yet their victories were rarely framed as intellect. They were dismissed as luck, persistence, or the mercy of the court. Marriage contracts, too, reveal the invisible presence of women's cleverness. While most were arranged by families, some women negotiated for themselves, pressing for clauses that protected their dowries, secured future rights, or ensured provision for children. These negotiations required wit, foresight, and an understanding of legal language, and yet, when successful, they were often attributed to the wisdom of fathers or guardians, not to the women themselves. Cleverness here had to hide beneath the fiction of obedience. Legal records occasionally reveal glimpses of women's voices, depositions in which they describe events with clarity, petitions in which they plead their cases with eloquence. These fragments remind us that women did speak, did argue, did reason, but their voices often survived only when filtered through the pens of male clerks who summarized or paraphrased, flattening nuance into formula. What we read in the archives are echoes, not the full resonance of their intellect. Suspicion haunted women who appeared too skilled in legal matters. A woman who argued too forcefully might be accused of arrogance, or worse, of meddling in affairs beyond her station. Just as knowledge of herbs could brand a healer a witch, knowledge of law could mark a widow or daughter as troublesome. Clever women had to perform ignorance, allowing men to appear as the true negotiators, even while quietly guiding strategy from behind the scenes. And yet, despite these barriers, women shaped the legal landscape in ways we cannot ignore. Their cases filled court rolls, their disputes shaped precedents, their struggles forced lords and magistrates to clarify rights and obligations. Each clever maneuver, a dowry preserved, an inheritance defended, a contract remembered, left ripples in the legal record, ripples that shaped how law itself evolved. Still, the broader picture is bleak. Law, like universities and guilds, became another fortress of exclusion, its language and rituals designed to keep women at the margins. Their intellect, no matter how sharp, was discounted before it could even be tested. And so the paradox deepened. Society demanded that women navigate law to survive, but punished them if they displayed too much skill in doing so. This exclusion carried lasting consequences. Without women's voices fully present in the shaping of law, entire systems were built that codified their subordination, limiting their rights to property, silencing them in courts, and defining their roles as perpetual dependents. The cleverness of women survived only in hidden strategies, in whispered advice, in quiet manipulations of the rules written against them. From these courtrooms and parchments, we begin to see the cumulative weight of silence. Clever women were not only absent from universities, guilds, and pulpits, but from the very laws that defined society. Their intellect flickered in fragments, but was never allowed to blaze openly, and yet their struggles and strategies reveal resilience, the determination to endure, to protect, to carve space even in hostile systems. From here, let us turn our gaze outward again, beyond the halls of law, into the world of medicine and science, where clever women left traces both practical and profound. For in healing and inquiry, their minds touched mysteries of the body and the cosmos, though once again their wisdom was branded suspect, their contributions hidden or erased. Now, let us wander into the realm of medicine and science, where clever women, though barred from universities and guilds, nevertheless played a vital role in tending to bodies, easing pain and exploring the mysteries of nature. Here their knowledge was both indispensable and precarious, treasured in secret, yet condemned when it became too visible. For in the medieval imagination, a woman who understood too much of the human body or the workings of the natural world stood perilously close to sorcery. Picture a small chamber lit by rushlight, the air heavy with the scent of dried lavender, rosemary and sage. Shelves are lined with jars of powders and bundles of herbs. A woman bends over a mortar, grinding plants into paste for a poultice. Her knowledge is practical, drawn from long tradition. Which herbs soothe fevers, which ease childbirth, which staunch bleeding. She has no degree, no official recognition, yet her skills are sought by neighbours, travellers and even lords. To those she heals, she is a gift. To those who mistrust her, she is a danger. Midwives were among the most significant figures in this hidden world of science. They guided women through childbirth, a perilous ordeal that tested the limits of body and soul. Midwives used herbs, prayers, charms, and practical techniques to bring life safely into the world. Their knowledge was profound, passed from generation to generation, preserved in memory rather than books. Yet this same knowledge left them vulnerable. If a child was stillborn, if a mother died, grief and fear could quickly turn into accusations. The midwife, once trusted, could suddenly be branded as one who meddled with unnatural forces. Women also tended the sick using remedies rooted in herbal lore. Their gardens were laboratories filled with plants whose properties they knew intimately. Yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, fennel for digestion. These were not guesses, but observations tested over centuries. And yet, because such knowledge existed outside the male-dominated structures of universities and medical faculties, it was dismissed as superstition or witchcraft. Male physicians, trained in theory and humours, often scoffed at women's remedies, even as they borrowed them in practice. Some women did leave written traces of their medical knowledge. The Trotula, a collection of texts on women's health from Salerno, was long attributed to a female physician named Trota. Whether or not she wrote it herself, the text reveals a deep concern for women's bodies, offering remedies and advice that male physicians often ignored. It reflects a perspective grounded in lived experience, in the care of mothers and daughters, wives and sisters. Yet even this work, preserved and studied, was often stripped of its female authorship, absorbed into a tradition that erased women's names. Astronomy and natural philosophy too saw flickers of women's contributions. Some noble women studied the stars, learning to read the heavens not for magic, but for timekeeping, navigation and agriculture. Their knowledge was practical, tied to the rhythms of land and season. Yet once again, intellect in these realms was dangerous. To watch the stars too closely to predict eclipses or weather could be read as meddling with forbidden forces. A man who studied the cosmos was a scholar. A woman who did so might be a witch. The suspicion reveals a deeper fear, that women's intellect might pierce mysteries reserved for men. Healing, childbirth, the body, the stars, these were liminal spaces, thresholds between life and death, between human and divine. To claim authority in these realms was to step into territory men believed their own. Clever women who dared to do so unsettled the order of things, and society responded with ridicule, suspicion, or persecution. And yet, despite this hostility, their knowledge endured. Mothers taught daughters the uses of herbs, midwives trained apprentices, remedies were whispered from neighbour to neighbour, preserved in kitchens and gardens rather than in lecture halls. Their science was not recorded in great tomes, but in daily practice, in the survival of communities through sickness and scarcity. Their wisdom lived in bodies healed, children born, lives extended, quiet legacies invisible to official histories. The tragedy is clear. While men debated theories of medicine and the movement of stars in universities, women's practical knowledge was dismissed, even when it was more effective. While physicians prescribed bleeding or purging, women offered herbs that eased suffering. While astronomers wrote treatises, women guided planting and harvest by the sky. Their contributions were hidden not because they lacked intellect, but because intellect in women was feared. This fear had lasting consequences. By branding women's science as superstition, medieval society not only endangered the women who practiced it, but also slowed its own progress. Knowledge that might have advanced medicine or astronomy was silenced, dismissed, or lost. The cost was not only borne by the women themselves, but by all who might have benefited from their wisdom. And yet, resilience remained. Even in silence, women's knowledge seeped through time, carried in folklore, in recipes, in family traditions. The persistence of herbal remedies, the survival of midwifery, the continued presence of women in healing roles, all testify to the endurance of intellect, even when unrecognized. Their cleverness refused to vanish, finding ways to survive in shadows. From here, let us move into another shadowed realm, the world of art, music, and literature, where women's minds found expression not always in argument or science, but in beauty. For while clever women were denied pulpits and classrooms, they sometimes sang, painted, or composed, leaving traces of brilliance disguised as devotion or entertainment. Let us now drift into the realm of art, music, and literature, where clever women found fragile but enduring outlets for their minds. In a world that silenced them in universities, courts, and laws, beauty became one of the few languages they could use to speak, and even then they had to cloak intellect in song, prayer, or allegory. To create was to think, to question, to imagine, and so through art, women left behind fragments of brilliance, though the world rarely gave them credit. Picture the echo of a convent chapel, its stone walls vibrating with voices in harmony. The sound is otherworldly, a tapestry of notes woven together. Here, women like Hildegard of Bingen composed music that still stirs hearts centuries later. Her chants were not mere echoes of tradition, they were innovations, marked by soaring melodies that broke from convention. Through music, Hildegard expressed theology, philosophy, and vision, intellect disguised as devotion. Her compositions reveal a mind as sharp as any scholar's, but her art protected her. Music was safe enough, feminine enough to escape the worst suspicions, even as it carried profound thought. In literature, we find similar disguises. Christine de Pizan, whose Book of the City of Ladies we have already glimpsed, filled her pages not only with argument, but with poetry and allegory. She built her defense of women through images of cities and walls, constructing a metaphor strong enough to shelter intellect. Poetry allowed her to question, to challenge, to dismantle misogyny, while appearing to play within the boundaries of acceptable art. Her cleverness became unassailable precisely because it was wrapped in beauty. Other women wrote devotional poetry, prayers that blended artistry with intellect. Their verses often carried double meanings, outwardly humble, inwardly bold. In rhymes and rhythms, they questioned suffering, pondered mysteries, or voiced longing for freedom of spirit. Their words, preserved in manuscripts, whisper across time not just piety but wit, imagination, and resilience. Visual art, too, bore women's touch, though their contributions are harder to trace. Illuminated manuscripts sometimes show hints of female scribes and artists, their hands painting delicate borders of flowers, saints, or strange beasts. These decorations were more than ornament. They were acts of interpretation, intellectual engagement with the text itself. Yet names were rarely recorded. Women's brushstrokes survive, but their identities are lost, absorbed into anonymity. In noble courts, women expressed intellect through patronage. A clever duchess might sponsor poets or musicians, shaping culture indirectly. She might commission tapestries filled with allegories, or songs that celebrated her lineage. Patronage was a form of influence, requiring discernment and vision. But once again, the cleverness behind it was rarely acknowledged. Credit went to the male artist, while the woman who enabled him remained in the shadows. Even entertainment carried traces of women's intellect. In domestic gatherings, they composed songs, told stories, or wove riddles into conversation. Folklore records fragments of women's voices, witty, playful, sometimes biting. These performances, though ephemeral, reveal a creativity that could not be contained. Yet they were often dismissed as trivial, women's amusements rather than serious contributions to culture. The paradox deepens. Art and music offered women the safest path for intellect, yet also concealed it most thoroughly. Their cleverness survived but disguised, mislabeled as devotion, leisure, or ornament. A hymn could be theology, a tapestry could be philosophy, a poem could be protest. But society saw only beauty, not intellect. Still, these disguises worked. Through them, women's thoughts slipped past the walls built around them. Their voices sang in choirs, their words flowed in poetry, their colours glowed in manuscripts. Beauty became a vessel for intellect, carrying it across centuries when argument alone would have been silenced. What is striking is the persistence of tone in these works. Women's art often carries a blend of melancholy and resilience, a sense of voices pressing against boundaries, longing to be heard. Their songs soar, but always within walls. Their poems imagine cities, but only as allegory. Their paintings decorate texts, but rarely claim authorship. The tension between brilliance and restraint is everywhere, shaping the very texture of medieval women's creativity. And so through beauty, clever women endured. They carved spaces where their minds could breathe, even if those spaces were hidden, fragile, or unacknowledged. Their art was both shield and sword, protecting them from suspicion while carrying truths the world was not ready to hear. From these songs and manuscripts, we near the end of our journey. For the story of why life was so hard for smart women in the medieval age is not only about exclusion and suspicion, it is also about endurance, about the sparks of intellect that refused to vanish. As we move toward the final part of our tale, we will gather these threads, the courts, the convents, the markets, the stories, the art, and reflect on what was lost, what survived, and what these women still whisper to us across time. And so we come to the quiet conclusion of our journey, where all the threads of this long tale are gathered together. For we have walked through villages and courts, through convents and universities, through markets and manuscripts, following the fragile traces of clever women in a world that mistrusted them. Each step has revealed a paradox, that intellect in women was both needed and feared, both celebrated in secret and condemned in public. Their stories, scattered like fragments across centuries, remind us of both loss and endurance. Why then was life so hard for smart women in the medieval age? The reasons are many, but together they form a pattern as heavy as the stones of a cathedral. First, there was exclusion. Universities, guilds and courts were closed to them, their gates guarded by laws and customs that insisted intellect belonged only to men. Then there was suspicion. Any woman who knew too much risked being labelled unnatural, arrogant, or even a witch. There was also silence. When women did contribute, their works were often hidden, erased, or attributed to men. And finally there was fear, the constant unspoken fear that clever women might disrupt the fragile order of a society built on obedience and hierarchy. And yet, in every space where doors were closed, women found cracks. In convents, they copied manuscripts and wrote visions. In households, they calculated accounts and passed knowledge in whispers. In markets, they bargained and brewed, weaving intellect into survival. In courts, they shaped politics with counsel and regency. In art and music, they disguised intellect as devotion and beauty. Even in folklore, where they were mocked or feared, their presence refused to vanish. Against all odds, they endured. The cost of this endurance, however, was immense. Think of the countless voices lost, women who might have been philosophers, scientists, theologians, poets, but who remained nameless, their thoughts buried by time. Think of the ideas never spoken, the books never written, the discoveries never made, because society chose to silence half its mind. The history of the medieval world is not only the story of what was achieved, but of what was prevented. The vast silence where women's intellect should have been allowed to flourish. And yet, the fragments that survived are enough to stir us even now. Hildegard's chants still soar, Julian's words still comfort, Christine's allegories still inspire, Heloise's letters still burn with longing and brilliance. Their resilience whispers across centuries, reminding us that intellect cannot be fully extinguished, even when pressed beneath suspicion and fear. It finds ways to endure, in song, in story, in hidden margins of manuscripts. If we listen closely, we hear the quiet strength of countless women whose names we will never know. The midwife whispering remedies, the widow defending her dower, the scribe painting flowers in the margins of a psalter, the mother teaching her daughter to read by candlelight. Each small act was a defiance, each fragment a spark. Together, they wove a hidden tapestry of intellect that stretched across the medieval age, unseen but unbroken. As the centuries turned, And the Renaissance and Enlightenment dawned, the silence began slowly to crack. Women's voices grew louder, their intellect more visible. But the struggles of later generations were built upon the quiescence of those medieval women who refused, even in silence, to surrender their minds. Their legacy is not one of defeat, but of persistence. And so, as we let this story settle into stillness, we may think of the medieval world not only as a place of suppression, but also as a place where seeds were planted, seeds of intellect and resilience that would bloom in centuries to come. The world tried to make life unbearable for smart women, but in the end their cleverness outlasted fear. It found ways to survive, to whisper, to endure. Close your eyes now and let the echoes of their voices fade into quiet. Think of stone walls, candle flames, the turning of parchment pages, the murmur of songs. Within them all lingers the presence of women who thought too deeply, who dreamed too fiercely, who lived too intelligently for the world that confined them. Their story is heavy, yes, but it is also luminous, a reminder that intellect, once kindled, is never easily extinguished. And so the tale rests here, in silence and in memory, where the past continues to breathe softly like a lullaby through the lives of those who dared to think. Though our story has reached what feels like a conclusion, there lingers still one more layer to explore, the long afterlife of these medieval struggles, and how the image of the clever woman shaped centuries beyond. For history does not end neatly at the close of an age. It echoes, repeating patterns in new guises, carrying forward fears, silences, and resistances. To understand fully why life was so difficult for smart women in the medieval world, we must also trace how that difficulty continued to shadow generations that followed. Picture Europe at the cusp of the Renaissance. New ideas are stirring, old texts rediscovered, art blossoming in colour and form. Men celebrate the rebirth of knowledge, proclaiming a new dawn of intellect. Yet the gates remain as closed as ever to women. Universities expand, but their charters still forbid female students. Printing presses hum, spreading books more widely than ever before, yet most women are denied access to this new flood of words. The learned woman, when she appears, is treated as a curiosity, admired briefly, then mocked or cast as dangerous. The medieval suspicion of clever women does not disappear with the changing age. It hardens, dressed now in the language of science and reason. The witch trials of the 15th and 16th centuries reveal the most terrifying legacy of medieval fears. Accusations that began centuries earlier, whispered against midwives and healers, swell into brutal persecutions. Thousands of women are executed across Europe, their knowledge of herbs and healing reframed as devil's work. The clever woman, the skilled woman, the independent woman, all become targets. What medieval society feared in shadows, the early modern world punishes in fire. The intellectual suspicion that once confined women to silence now transforms into mass hysteria. And yet, resistance grows too. The writings of Christine de Pizan are copied and read, inspiring women to imagine themselves not as weak or deceitful, but as part of a noble tradition of intellect. Convents continue to nurture creativity, producing scholars like Teresa of Avila in Spain. Noble women act as patrons of the arts, quietly shaping the course of culture. The spirit of Hildegard, Heloise Julian, and countless others lingers, inspiring women to write, to think, to question, even when doing so remains perilous. The echoes stretch even further into modern times. The stereotype of the dangerous or unfeminine clever woman did not vanish with the Middle Ages. For centuries, women in science, politics, and literature faced the same suspicion, that their intellect was unnatural, that it threatened order, that it must be contained. The medieval roots of this suspicion run deep, shaping laws, traditions, and even the stories we tell today. Fairy tales still warn of wicked stepmothers and cunning witches, echoes of those older fears that once branded intellect in women as dangerous. And yet the endurance of those medieval women offers hope. For despite silencing suspicion and persecution, their brilliance survived in fragments. Each hymn, each manuscript, each whispered remedy is a reminder that intellect cannot be wholly extinguished. Their resilience planted seeds that later generations watered until eventually women gained entry to schools, universities, and public life. The struggle was long, but the foundations were laid in those centuries of endurance. To reflect on this is to see the medieval age not only as a time of oppression, but as a crucible in which resilience was forged. Smart women learned to survive in silence, to disguise intellect as devotion, to hide knowledge in beauty. Their strategies may seem cautious, even timid, but they were acts of survival in a world determined to erase them. Without such strategies, their voices might not have reached us at all. So when we look back at that world, its castles and cloisters, its markets and manuscripts, we see not only the weight of suppression, but also the sparks of defiance. Sparks that glimmered in secret gardens, in convent songs, in household ledgers, in whispered tales by firelight. Sparks that survived storms of suspicion and fires of persecution. Sparks that remind us even now of the courage it took simply to think, to know, to remember. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of clever women in the medieval age. Not grand triumphs or public victories, but the persistence of thought against all odds. They remind us that intellect is not always loud, not always celebrated. Sometimes it is a whisper in the dark, a song in a chapel, a flower painted in the margin of a manuscript. Small, fragile, easily overlooked, and yet enduring, powerful enough to reach us centuries later. The medieval world made life unbearably hard for smart women. But those women, in turn, made the world richer, wiser, more resilient, even if history tried to deny it. Their story does not end with silence. It continues in every voice that dares to speak, every mind that dares to think, every woman who claims her right to knowledge. And so though their lives were marked by struggle, their legacy is one of survival, and survival in the end is its own form of victory. Let us wander one step further into the quiet reflection that comes after the telling of a long tale. For though we have traced centuries of struggle, suspicion and silence, there remains something to be said about the hidden strength of clever women. The strength not only to endure, but to imagine futures their world refused them. This imagining, fragile though it was, became one of their most powerful legacies. Picture a medieval woman seated by a window, a book open in her lap. Outside, the village hums with the familiar sounds of life, the cry of vendors, the creak of carts, the toll of the church bell. But inside her mind she travels far. The words before her, perhaps scripture, perhaps poetry, perhaps fragments of philosophy, ignite thoughts that stretch beyond her narrow world. She wonders about the order of creation, about the nature of justice, about the fate of souls. These questions may never leave her lips, but they live within her, shaping how she sees the world, how she guides her children, how she prays. Her intellect, denied a public stage, nevertheless creates a private realm of freedom. This private freedom was perhaps the most radical achievement of clever women in the medieval world. They could not teach in universities or write laws, but they could carve inner spaces of thought where no bishop or magistrate could reach. In journals, in poems, in whispered conversations, they nurtured ideas that quietly resisted the silence imposed on them. These inner worlds, though invisible, carried a defiant truth, that women's minds existed, sharp and restless, even when society insisted otherwise. Consider again the mystics, whose visions offered them a voice under the guise of divine revelation. Their writings did more than express devotion. They reimagined the very nature of faith. Julian of Norwich envisioned God as both mother and father, a radical softness in an age of harsh theology. Hildegard of Bingen described the cosmos as a living, breathing harmony, blending science and spirit. These were not merely mystical musings, but intellectual reimaginings of reality. They proved that even within the tightest constraints, clever women found ways to dream of worlds beyond. Even in domestic life, imagination left its mark. Mothers told stories that bent the rules of folklore, inserting wit and wisdom where others might have expected only obedience. Wives, while appearing submissive, shaped family decisions with foresight and strategy. Market women, with clever tongues, crafted negotiations that required improvisation as much as calculation. In all these acts lay a kind of artistry, an ability to imagine outcomes, to shape futures in small but significant ways. And though many of these imaginings were hidden, they seeped into culture. The tales of clever maidens who solved riddles, the songs of women who sang of longing and strength, the remedies that combined prayer with knowledge of nature, all reveal intellect disguised as tradition. In their quiet persistence, they passed forward not only survival, but possibility. This, perhaps, is the greatest irony of the medieval age, that while it tried so fiercely to silence women's intellect, it also created the conditions for resilience. Clever women learned to speak in code, to wrap wisdom in song, to disguise thought as devotion. In doing so, they developed strategies that allowed their voice to slip past censors, to cross generations, to reach us today. Their endurance was not passive. It was imaginative, adaptive, quietly revolutionary. And so, when we think of the medieval world, we must remember not only the chains, but the hidden gardens. Spaces where women read by candlelight, where they painted margins with flowers, where they whispered remedies, where they sang visions into the air. These gardens of thought, unseen by chroniclers, nurtured seeds that would bloom centuries later when women finally began to claim openly what they had always known in secret, that their intellect was as sharp as necessary, as unquenchable as any man's. What lingers now, after centuries of suppression and centuries more of struggle, is not only the memory of suffering but the whisper of survival. Their stories remind us that even in the harshest times, the human mind seeks to grow, to question, to imagine. And when denied the stage, it finds the margins. When barred from the pulpit, it sings in hymns. When excluded from law, it survives in stories and strategies. The clever women of the medieval age lived lives that were often small in the eyes of history, but within those lives burned immense courage. They remind us that intellect does not need applause to endure, that thought does not vanish because it is silenced, that imagination thrives even in captivity. Their story is not only of hardship, but of quiet triumph, the triumph of survival, of persistence, of dreams that could not be extinguished. And so as we leave behind the halls, the courts, the cloisters, and the markets of the medieval world, we carry with us not only sorrow for what was lost, but gratitude for what endured. The clever women of that age, though uncelebrated in their time, still whisper to us now, think, endure, imagine. Their lullaby of resilience echoes through the centuries, soft but unbroken, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be silenced. Let us wander once more into the past, not to revisit sorrow, but to linger in reflection, in the deep silence where the voices of clever women still seem to breathe. For if the medieval world often crushed their brilliance beneath suspicion and silence, it also revealed something profound, that intellect is not easily destroyed. It bends, it hides, it adapts, but it does not die. And so, in this final turning of our tale, we may look again at the long shadows of that time and find within them both grief and light. Imagine a medieval library, stone walls cool and dim, rows of manuscripts bound in leather, the faint smell of vellum and ink. A scribe bends over a desk copying words that have travelled across centuries. Somewhere in those shelves lie the works of women, though their names are few. Hildegard's visions, Julian's meditations, Christine's allegories, small islands in an ocean of male voices. But beside them, in silence, live countless unnamed hands. Nuns who copied scripture, wives who recorded recipes, widows who preserved accounts. Their intellect is hidden, but it lingers in the margins like a ghostly presence. The tragedy of history is not only in the voices we hear, but in the ones we do not. For every woman who left a book or a letter, there were thousands more whose ideas vanished with their deaths, unrecorded, unremembered. Their cleverness lived only in conversation, in teaching children, in guiding households, in advising quietly, and when they were gone, the world forgot. This forgetting is as much a part of the medieval story as the surviving texts. It is a silence as heavy as stone, pressing across centuries. And yet silence itself can speak. The very absence of women's voices in chronicles, laws and universities tells us something about the fear they inspired. A society that truly believed women weak and foolish would not have needed to exclude them so fiercely. It was precisely because their intellect was undeniable that it had to be constrained. The walls of universities, the suspicion of midwives, the ridicule of clever wives in folk tales, all these reveal not confidence in men's superiority, but anxiety. Fear that women's minds, if allowed to flourish openly, might reshape the world. This fear gave rise to cruelty, but it also gives us, centuries later, a strange kind of hope. For it reminds us that women's intellect was never absent, never lacking. It was always there, strong enough to inspire fear, strong enough to endure despite silence. The medieval world did not fail because women lacked brilliance. It failed because it refused to embrace it. Now imagine again the figures we have met along this journey. Heloise, writing letters of passion and philosophy. Christine de Pizan, building her allegorical city of ladies. Hildegard, filling the air with soaring chants. Julian, whispering comfort in an age of plague. Each one carved a space for intellect in a hostile world. Each one a flame flickering against the wind. Around them, countless unnamed women tended smaller fires, in kitchens, gardens, markets, and stories. Together, they formed a constellation of light, dimmed but never extinguished. As we close this story, it is worth pausing to imagine the lives they might have lived in a different world. A world where Heloise could have taught at a university, where Christine might have debated openly with philosophers, where Hildegard's science could have been studied without suspicion, where Julian's theology might have shaped councils. The loss of such a world is immeasurable, not only for women, but for all humanity. And yet the seeds they planted did not die. They waited, quietly, until the soil of history became ready to receive them. And so when we reflect on why life was so unbearably hard for smart women in the medieval age, we must also remember what their struggle achieved. They endured so that later voices could rise louder. They imagined so that later generations could build. Their silence, though heavy, was not empty. It was filled with dreams that finally broke into sound centuries later. In the end, the story of clever women in the medieval world is not only one of suppression, but of persistence. It is the story of intellect that refused to die, of thought that survived in whispers, of wisdom that lived in the shadows until the world was ready for its light. Their lullaby of resilience, fragile but enduring, still drifts through time, soft as candlelight, steady as stone, a reminder that even in the darkest ages, the human mind cannot be silenced forever.